Allow me to greet you with words from 1 Peter chapter 2, where it says, "But you were a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness and into this marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." Good morning. Well, the scripture for your encouragement today comes from Mark chapter 13. I'll read the first 8 verses, but I encourage you to read the chapter for yourself. Mark chapter 13, verse 1. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and the kingdom against kingdom, and there will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." May the Lord bless the reading of his word. Well, for those living through the events that Jesus is describing to his disciples around AD 70, so about 40 years after Jesus' last years on earth in the flesh before resurrection. The destruction of Jerusalem around that time, about 40 years later, the destruction of the temple, to be specific, and even the preceding events like the Roman Empire hoisting up its insignia on the temple, this blasphemous to Jews, a sign of Rome trying to declare their sovereignty over God, the hoisting up of Roman insignias and signs of authority in the temple, in the places like the Holy of Holies. This would be what they would refer to as a desolating sacrilege. All these events, and particularly, again, specifically, the destruction of the temple, would have seemed very much like the end of the world. Remember, Jerusalem, for Peter, James, John, Andrew, for the disciples of that time, Jerusalem was a political capital, it was a cultural capital, it was an economic capital, and in all that together, it was a religious capital. It was the center of their faith. They made pilgrimages up to Jerusalem. They waited there. They anointed the king in Jerusalem. The most special place of worship is in Jerusalem. And at the center of Jerusalem, the key to Jerusalem's identity of a city where God dwelt was the temple. The temple was the holy place of the city, of the nation. It was a standing testament to God's desire to be amongst his people. It's the place where God met his people, like literally in sacrifices and in the Holy of Holies and in the presence of that he maintained in the temple. The temple was a statement that God was here on earth amongst his people. It was a place where God mediated out forgiveness and grace. It was a place where we were reminded of his holiness and our sin. The temple was also a place, because it was beauty, and in some of the ancient writings, the temple is called the most beautiful building of the ancient world, or known world at that time, often writing in this area. The temple had also become a place of national pride, of national identity, of identity as a people. It's interesting how things that are about God, we can make them about ourselves, and we can take security or pride in them on our own. The temple was meant to make statements about who God was, but the Jewish people could also, and just like we can also, uh, uh, translate those, or make those translate ourselves translate those into statements about us, that we're a special people, that we are somehow different and better because of. Either way, the destruction of the temple uh, specifically would communicate to people of that day that God had either abandoned them, or had judged them, that he had judged them with a final judgment, or that he had been defeated by that Rome's deities were more powerful than God's deities. That's what they would have envisioned by the destruction of the temple. Or maybe all the above, or something else altogether. It was very confusing. If God is still on the throne in heaven, how the temple could be destroyed. I wonder what what has that type of foundational importance to us. Uh, if it were like a political capital, if you could imagine um, all of Washington, D.C., and our state capitals of every state, but also economic, so maybe all of New York and Wall Street. Cultural, so any cultural centers, Los Angeles or New Orleans or other cultural centers. But not just those, religious, so maybe every church building. And that getting wiped out on one day, all those places, Washington and New York and Los Angeles and New Orleans and all of their church buildings, all these things being wiped off the face of the earth. I'm trying to think what would have that kind of significance of the destruction of Jerusalem to us. How would that be disillusioned? How would we be bewildered, discouraged? Maybe it would be different types of institutions. The institution of a family. Maybe we've always defined ourselves as certain roles, as a mother, a father, a brother, a son, so forth. And maybe those identities were taken from us, or maybe we've defined ourselves by the income that we've had, or the jobs that we do, and that was taken from us. Or other foundational roles. Again, the destruction of the temple to them would have been like having everything they know taken away. I hope that we don't have to experience having the foundational institutions of our life, those identities that we gain so much from, taking away. But even if we do, especially if we do, I would want you to know and remember verse 8 in Mark chapter 13. Verse 8 said, "There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." And so what would seem like to us, if all those institutions in our life, or those experiences or identities that we gain so much from, were taken away, what would seem like to us to be the end of the world, it's important for us to remember it's just the end of a world. It's the end of what we knew, but it's not the end of everything. Even in that moment, or especially in that moment, God is doing something new. When the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed in around AD 70, God was not done. It was like a birthing, a painful birthing of a new stage of history that God was bringing forth, he was going to use. Well, after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Jewish people recentered their faith from the temple to the Torah and Torah law. And so that's when the onset of this kind of rabbinical approach and synagogue approach as a base of worship began, that persists to this very day. And it also allowed the Jewish people to spread over the earth, and even more so for Christians. Before this time, Christians were really Jewish Christians were really housed and centered there at the temple and in Jerusalem. But from here forward, the Christian faith would spread out over the whole world. It was the end of a world, but not necessarily the end of the world. God still had plans. And especially when we face suffering, or all that we know has been taken away, or we encounter unimaginable change and challenge. Those are the types of times that God is doing something new. Again, what you see in Matthew 13 is Jesus warning his disciples of a coming suffering that would happen in about 40 years, and helping those that he was speaking to know that God's not done. And even when everything that you know and you count on and that makes you feel secure has passed away, this might very well just be a new beginning where God is working. You'll see this referred to in several ways throughout Mark chapter 13, but this is the part that I also appreciate here. Later on, you see that it says, verse 20, "And if the Lord has not cut short those days, no one would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he has chosen, he has cut short those days." Again, we want to think primarily as a beginning point, about 40 years after this time, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. "And if anyone says to you at that time, 'Look, here's the Messiah,' or 'Look, there he is,' do not believe. False messiahs and false prophets will appear and produce signs and omens to lead astray. But be alert, I have already told you everything. But in those days after the suffering, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from the heaven, and the powers in heaven will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds." Now, Jesus is he's entered that moment, that disillusioning moment, bewildering moment, and he's connecting it to the final culmination of him setting all things right. "Then he'll send out the angels and gather up the elect from the four winds and the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven." Jesus is still working. He's still nothing that's happened that he can't meet and make right. Well, I hope that can be an encouragement to you. This idea that even if all that we know is wiped away, the Lord is, even in those times, able to do something new. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, even in the hard times, or especially in the hard times, even when all things have been wiped away, or especially in those times, to him be the glory and the honor and the power forever and ever. Amen. May the Lord bless you.